The wind howled across the Tibetan plateau with a ferocity that seemed almost alive, carrying with it particles of ice that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. It was here, in one of the most remote and unforgiving corners of our planet, that 5 scientists embarked on what should have been a routine geological expedition in the autumn of 2019. Their mission was straightforward, or so it seemed, to collect rock samples from an ancient lava field that geologists believed might contain mineral deposits dating back millions of years, perhaps even offering clues about the early formation of the Himalayan mountain range. The team consisted of Dr. Chen, a geologist from Stanford University, whose reputation for meticulous fieldwork had made her the natural choice to lead the expedition. Beside her was Marcus Holloway, a British geophysicist known for his dry humor and uncanny ability to read seismic data like others might read a novel. Then there was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese volcanologist whose quiet demeanor masked a brilliant analytical mind. The 4th member was James Rodriguez, a young but ambitious doctoral candidate from Colombia who had joined the team to gather data for his dissertation on volcanic mineral composition. And finally, there was Emma Kingsley, an experienced field photographer and documentarian who had spent the better part of a decade capturing scientific expeditions in the world's most hostile environments. Together, they represented a perfect blend of expertise, experience, and youthful enthusiasm. They had set up their base camp on September 14th at an elevation of nearly 14,000 feet, where the air was so thin that even simple tasks left them breathless and dizzy. The landscape around them was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. A vast expanse of rust-colored rock formations stretching endlessly toward horizons that seemed to merge with the pale sky. At night, the temperature plummeted to well below freezing, and the stars appeared so close and brilliant that Emma often stood outside her tent for hours, her camera forgotten in her hands, simply staring upward in silent wonder. During those first few days, the team settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were dedicated to equipment checks and planning the day's collection routes. Afternoons found them scattered across the lava field, their bright orange jackets the only spots of color in that monochrome wilderness, each scientist absorbed in their particular specialty. Evenings brought them together around a portable heater in the mess tent, where they would share their findings, compare notes, and occasionally indulge in the kind of philosophical conversations that emerge when human beings find themselves so utterly removed from civilization. Marcus would joke about the terrible freeze-dried food. Yuki would share stories about volcanic eruptions she had witnessed in Indonesia, and Sarah would remind them all to stay hydrated and mindful of altitude sickness. It was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of expedition that scientists dream about. Challenging, yes, but also filled with discovery and camaraderie. But on the morning of September 23rd, everything changed. The team had planned an ambitious trek to a remote section of the lava field, an area that satellite imagery suggested might contain unusual crystalline formations embedded in the ancient volcanic rock. They set out before dawn, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through the darkness as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Sarah led the way with her GPS device, followed by Yuki and James, while Marcus and Emma brought up the rear, with Emma stopping occasionally to photograph the landscape as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of deep purple and orange. The hike was grueling, taking them through a narrow canyon whose walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out the sun and creating an eerie twilight even as the day brightened around them. The sound of their boots crunching on loose rock echoed strangely in that confined space, and more than once, Emma remarked that it felt as though they were walking through the ribcage of some enormous fossilized creature. After nearly 3 hours of steady climbing, they emerged from the canyon onto a plateau that took their collective breath away. Before them stretched a field of glittering black obsidian, the volcanic glass catching the sunlight and reflecting it in 1,000 directions, creating an almost blinding display that forced them to shield their eyes. It was James who noticed it first. He had wandered slightly ahead of the group, drawn by what appeared to be an unusual depression in the ground, about 50 yards from where the others had stopped to rest and drink water. He called out to Sarah, his voice carrying a strange quality that made her look up sharply from her equipment. "There was something in that depression," he said. "Something that didn't belong." The team gathered around him, staring down into what appeared to be a natural pit, roughly circular and perhaps 20 feet across. At its center, barely visible beneath a thin layer of volcanic dust, was what looked like a metallic surface. The material was dark, almost black, but it possessed a peculiar sheen that was distinctly unnatural. Sarah's scientific mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Could it be a meteorite fragment? Some kind of mineral deposit with unusually high metal content? But as Marcus climbed down into the pit and brushed away more of the dust, it became clear that this was something manufactured. The surface was too smooth, too regular, and as more of it was revealed, they could see what appeared to be geometric patterns etched into its surface, symbols that none of them recognized, but which clearly suggested intentional design. For the next 2 hours, the team worked to carefully excavate around the object, documenting everything with Emma's cameras and Marcus's measurement tools. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. The metallic surface wasn't just a fragment or a piece of debris. It appeared to be the top of a much larger structure, possibly buried beneath tons of volcanic rock. Yuki, with her expertise in volcanic activity, estimated that based on the geological layers surrounding it, this object had been here for at least several thousand years, possibly much longer. The implications were staggering, almost too enormous to fully comprehend. Had some ancient civilization achieved a level of technological sophistication that history had no record of? Or was this something else entirely, something that challenged their fundamental understanding of human development and perhaps even human origin? Sarah made the decision to contact their support team back at the university via satellite phone, but the connection was poor, crackling with static that made communication nearly impossible. She managed to convey that they had found something significant, something that required immediate attention from specialists. But before she could provide details, the connection died completely. They tried for another 20 minutes to re-establish contact, but the satellite phone remained stubbornly silent, its display showing no signal despite the clear sky above them. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sarah made the difficult decision that they would need to return to base camp for the night. The temperature was already dropping, and being caught out on the plateau after dark would be dangerous, possibly fatal. They would return the next morning with better equipment, additional supplies, and hopefully a working communication system. But Marcus insisted on taking measurements of the exposed portion of the structure, and Yuki wanted to collect rock samples from the surrounding area. James was carefully photographing the geometric symbols, trying to capture them from every possible angle. Emma had set up her video equipment and was recording everything, her documentarian instincts telling her that they were witnessing something that would rewrite textbooks and possibly alter humanity's understanding of its own history. It was during these final preparations, as the long shadows of evening began to stretch across the obsidian field, that the incident occurred. The sound came first, a low vibration that they felt in their bones more than heard with their ears. It seemed to emanate from the structure itself, growing steadily louder until it became a deep thrumming that made their teeth ache and their vision blur slightly. Yuki shouted something about seismic activity, warning everyone to get away from the pit, but her words were swallowed by the increasing intensity of the sound. Then came the light. It erupted from the geometric symbols on the structure's surface, a brilliant blue-white radiance that was painful to look at directly. Emma's camera, still recording, captured the moment when that light expanded outward in a perfect sphere, engulfing all 5 scientists in its luminescence. The footage shows them frozen in that instant, their faces turned toward the light, their expressions caught somewhere between wonder and terror. And then, for exactly 3.7 seconds according to the camera's timestamp, there is nothing but white, a complete overexposure that obliterates all detail. When the image returns, when the light fades and the normal gray afternoon light of the plateau reasserts itself, the 5 scientists are standing exactly where they were before, apparently unharmed. But the structure, The metallic surface that had been so carefully excavated is gone. The pit remains, but it is empty now, containing nothing but bare volcanic rock, as though the structure had never existed at all. For several long moments, none of them moved or spoke. They stood there in the gathering dusk, each processing what had just happened, each trying to reconcile the evidence of their senses with their scientific training. Emma's hands trembled as she checked her camera, confirming that it had indeed recorded the event. Marcus's instruments had all shut down, their displays blank and unresponsive. Sarah's GPS device was showing coordinates that placed them more than 200 miles from their actual location. And James, young James, whose enthusiasm had driven him to investigate the depression in the first place, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, and the question hung in the cold air like a visible thing. They gathered their equipment in silence, moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced field researchers. But there was a tension now, an unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. The hike back through the canyon seemed longer, darker, and the echoes of their footsteps sounded different somehow, as though the rocks themselves had been altered by whatever they had witnessed. By the time they reached base camp, full darkness had fallen, and the temperature had dropped to nearly 20 degrees below zero. They huddled in the mess tent, none of them particularly interested in food, all of them reviewing the footage and data from the plateau. Emma's video was clear and undeniable. They had encountered something that defied explanation, something that existed outside the boundaries of known science. And as they sat there, warming their hands around cups of instant coffee, trying to make sense of the impossible, none of them yet realized that the real mystery was just beginning. None of them yet understood that when that light had engulfed them on the plateau, something had fundamentally changed. And one of them, one of these 5 scientists who had set out that morning as colleagues and friends, was no longer entirely what they appeared to be. The night that followed was one of fragmented sleep and uneasy dreams. In her tent, Sarah found herself waking repeatedly, each time with the conviction that she had heard something moving outside, footsteps crunching on the frost-hardened ground. But when she unzipped the tent flap and looked out into the darkness, there was nothing but the vast silence of the plateau and the distant stars burning overhead. Marcus lay in his sleeping bag staring at the tent's ceiling, his mind replaying those 3.7 seconds of white light over and over, trying to apply rational analysis to something that seemed to exist beyond the reach of rationality. Yuki had fallen into a deep sleep almost immediately upon returning to camp, which was unusual for her, as she typically struggled with insomnia at high altitudes. James sat with his laptop, examining the photographs he had taken of the geometric symbols, zooming in on each detail, searching for some pattern or meaning that might explain what they had witnessed. And Emma reviewed her footage again and again, watching the moment when the light consumed them, watching their frozen faces, watching the inexplicable disappearance of what should have been the archaeological find of the century. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the tent fabric and carrying with it strange sounds that might have been nothing more than air moving through rock formations, but which sounded disconcertingly like distant voices calling out words in a language that belonged to no human tongue. When dawn finally broke over the plateau, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold, the team emerged from their tents, looking haggard and worn. Sarah had called a meeting before breakfast, insisting that they needed to discuss what had happened and decide on their next course of action. They gathered in the mess tent, the portable heater struggling against the morning cold, their breath visible in the air as they spoke. The conversation that followed revealed the first cracks in their collective understanding. Marcus insisted that what they had experienced was some kind of seismic event, possibly coupled with an electromagnetic phenomenon that had caused them all to hallucinate. Yuki agreed that geological activity could explain the vibration and the sound, but she had no scientific framework for the light or the disappearance of the structure. James pointed out that Emma's camera had recorded the event, which meant it couldn't have been a hallucination unless the camera itself had somehow been affected. Sarah listened to all of them, her expression thoughtful, before suggesting that they needed to return to the site immediately. Whatever they had encountered, it represented a discovery of potentially enormous significance, and as scientists, they had an obligation to investigate it thoroughly, to document it, to understand it. Emma was the only one who expressed reservation. There was something about the whole experience that felt wrong to her, she said, something that made her instincts scream caution. But she was outvoted, and by 7:30 that morning, they were once again making their way toward the narrow canyon that led to the Obsidian Plateau. The return journey felt different. The landscape that had seemed merely desolate the day before now felt actively hostile, as though the rocks themselves were watching their progress with malevolent interest. The canyon walls seemed to press in closer, and the echoes of their movements were sharper, more immediate. Marcus noticed it first. The way sound was behaving strangely, arriving at their ears just a fraction of a second before it should, creating a disorienting sensation that made him stumble more than once on the loose rock. When they finally emerged onto the plateau, the scene was exactly as they had left it. The pit was still there, empty and unremarkable, showing no trace of the metallic structure that had been excavated the previous day. Sarah organized them into a systematic search pattern, and for the next 3 hours, they combed every inch of the surrounding area, looking for any evidence, any clue, any sign that the structure had existed. They found nothing. The volcanic rock showed no indication of recent disturbance beyond the excavation they themselves had performed. There were no unusual mineral deposits, no electromagnetic anomalies on Marcus's repaired instruments, no geometric symbols etched into any surface. It was as though the entire event had been erased from reality, leaving behind only their memories and Emma's video footage as proof that anything had happened at all. It was during the search that Sarah first noticed something odd about Yuki. The Japanese volcanologist was working methodically, as always, collecting rock samples and documenting the geological layers, but there was something off about her movements. They were too precise, too mechanical, lacking the small inefficiencies and unconscious gestures that characterize human motion. Sarah watched her for several minutes, unable to articulate exactly what was wrong, but feeling increasingly certain that something was not right. When she mentioned it to Marcus, he looked at Yuki and frowned, then shook his head and suggested that they were all on edge, seeing strangeness where there was only fatigue and stress. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. And as the morning wore on, she found herself watching Yuki more closely, cataloging the small differences. The way Yuki's eyes didn't quite track movement the way they should, following objects with a smoothness that was almost robotic. The way she didn't blink as frequently as normal, sometimes going for minutes at a time with her eyes fixed and unmoving. The way she spoke, her words perfectly formed and grammatically correct, but somehow lacking the small pauses and verbal tics that had always characterized her speech pattern. By noon, they had exhausted their search and found nothing new. Sarah made the decision to pack up base camp and return to civilization. The expedition was effectively over, and whatever they had encountered on the plateau, it was clear that they would need resources and expertise beyond what their small team could provide. The hike back down from the high plateau took 2 days, retracing their route through increasingly hospitable terrain as the altitude decreased and the air thickened and warmed. During those 2 days, the strange observations about Yuki multiplied. James noticed that she never seemed to tire, maintaining the same steady pace regardless of how challenging the terrain became, while the rest of them struggled with exhaustion and altitude-related fatigue. Emma observed that Yuki's appetite had changed. She ate exactly the same amount at each meal, consuming her food with mechanical efficiency, never expressing preference or displeasure, never asking for seconds or declining portions. Marcus caught her standing outside her tent in the middle of the night, perfectly still, her face turned toward the stars, and when he asked if she was all right, she had turned to look at him with an expression that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien, her features arranged in what should have been a smile, but which somehow failed to convey any actual warmth or emotion. They reached the town of Lhasa on October 1st, disheveled and exhausted, and immediately made their way to their hotel, a modest establishment that catered to scientists and adventurers passing through the region. Sarah spent the first several hours attempting to contact the university, finally managing to get through to her department chair and explain in broad terms that the expedition had encountered something unusual and that they would be returning earlier than planned. She was careful not to provide too many details over the phone, aware that what they had to report would sound absurd without the supporting evidence of Emma's footage and their collective testimony. The plan was to rest for a day, organize their samples and documentation, and then catch a flight to Beijing, where they would connect to international flights back to their respective institutions. It should have been a straightforward end to an extraordinary expedition. But that evening, as they gathered for dinner in the hotel's small restaurant, the situation took a turn that transformed their scientific mystery into something far more disturbing and personal. They were seated around a circular table, the first proper meal they had enjoyed in weeks, when James made a casual observation that he had forgotten his journal back in one of the supply boxes they had shipped ahead. It was a small thing, inconsequential really, but Yuki's response was immediate and precise. She recited, word for word, the last 3 entries James had made in that journal, entries he had written privately in his tent during the final days of the expedition. The table fell silent. James stared at her, his face pale, and asked how she could possibly know what he had written. Yuki's expression didn't change. She explained, in that same mechanically precise voice, that she had read the journal while James was collecting samples on the plateau. But that was impossible, James insisted. The journal had never left his tent, had never been out of his personal pack. The conversation that followed grew increasingly tense. Sarah demanded to know what was going on, her voice sharp with concern and growing alarm. Marcus suggested hesitantly that perhaps Yuki had seen the journal at some point and James had simply forgotten. But Emma, who had been watching Yuki carefully throughout the exchange, spoke up with a question that cut through all the rationalizations and forced them to confront what they had been avoiding. She asked Yuki to describe, in detail, what she remembered about her childhood in Osaka, where she had grown up, where she had gone to school, the names of her family members and friends. Yuki looked at Emma for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the restaurant's overhead lights with an intensity that seemed almost to glow. And then she began to speak. She described a childhood in Osaka with perfect accuracy, recounting memories of her elementary school, her teachers' names, the layout of her family's apartment, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of traffic on the street below their windows. Every detail was correct, verifiable, exactly as the real Yuki Tanaka would remember it. But there was something wrong with the delivery, something uncanny about the way she recounted these deeply personal memories with the same flat affect, the same emotional distance she might use to describe a geological formation or a chemical process. Sarah felt her stomach clench with a fear she couldn't quite name. She looked around the table at her colleagues and saw her own apprehension reflected in their faces. Something was profoundly wrong, but none of them could articulate exactly what it was, and the rational scientific part of their minds rebelled against the implications that were beginning to form in the shadows of their thoughts. It was Marcus who finally voiced what they were all thinking, though he framed it as a hypothesis rather than an accusation. He suggested carefully that perhaps the event on the plateau had affected Yuki in some way, caused some kind of neurological damage or psychological trauma that was manifesting in these unusual behaviors. They should get her to a hospital, he said, have her examined by medical professionals who could determine if there was some physical injury or chemical imbalance that might explain the changes they were observing. Yuki listened to this proposal with what appeared to be polite interest, then stated, simply and without emotion, that she felt perfectly fine and saw no need for medical examination. Sarah, drawing on her authority as expedition leader, insisted that it wasn't optional. They would take Yuki to the local hospital the next morning, and that was final. Yuki nodded in apparent agreement, but there was something in that nod, some quality of acquiescence that felt performative rather than genuine, that made Emma's skin prickle with goosebumps despite the warm restaurant air. They finished their meal in near silence, each lost in their own troubled thoughts, and when they finally retired to their rooms, Sarah found herself unable to sleep, lying in the darkness and listening to the sounds of the hotel, wondering what exactly had returned from the plateau with them, and whether the woman they called Yuki Tanaka was still, in any meaningful sense, their colleague and friend. The next morning brought a development that shattered any remaining hope that this was simply a medical issue. Sarah woke early and immediately went to Yuki's room, intending to accompany her to the hospital as planned. She knocked on the door and received no answer. She knocked again, louder, and called Yuki's name. Still nothing. A cold dread settling in her chest, Sarah went to the front desk and convinced the manager to open the room, claiming a medical emergency. The door swung open to reveal a space that looked as though it had never been occupied. The bed was perfectly made, the surfaces clear of any personal items, the bathroom pristine and unused. But most disturbing of all, there was no sign of Yuki's equipment, her samples, her documentation, any of the materials she had collected during the expedition. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had Yuki left during the night? Had she been taken? Or had there never been a Yuki in that room at all? She rushed back to her own room and called the others, her hands shaking as she dialed. Within minutes they were all gathered in the empty room, staring at the undisturbed bed, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they remembered. Emma checked her video footage, scrolling through hours of recordings, and found Yuki present in every frame from the plateau, visible and tangible and apparently real. James pulled up the group photos they had taken throughout the expedition, and there she was, smiling in the background, her image captured by multiple cameras on multiple occasions. But the room before them told a different story, suggested an impossible absence. And as they stood there in that clean, empty space, they began to understand that what had returned from the plateau with them might not have been their colleague at all. Might have been something else entirely, something that wore Yuki's face and spoke with her voice and carried her memories, but which was fundamentally, terrifyingly other. The discovery of the empty room triggered a cascade of increasingly frantic activity. Sarah immediately contacted the local police, attempting to file a missing persons report, but the language barrier and the bizarre nature of her story created obstacles that seemed almost deliberately placed in her path. The officer who finally agreed to take her statement listened with poorly concealed skepticism as she tried to explain that a member of her expedition team had vanished from a locked hotel room, leaving behind no trace of her presence despite having checked in the previous evening. The officer asked for Yuki's passport, her identification documents, any proof that she had actually been at the hotel. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had never seen Yuki present any documentation at check-in. The woman at the front desk, when questioned, had no record of a fifth guest in their party. According to the hotel's system, only 4 scientists had registered: Sarah Chen, Marcus Holloway, James Rodriguez, and Emma Kingsley. There was no Yuki Tanaka in their database, no credit card on file, no signature on any registration form. It was as though she had moved through the hotel like a ghost, visible to them, but somehow invisible to the normal bureaucratic mechanisms that tracked human presence and movement. Marcus took it upon himself to contact the university directly, reaching out to colleagues who had worked with Yuki for years, people who could confirm her existence and perhaps provide insight into what might have happened. The responses he received only deepened the mystery. The Stanford Geology Department confirmed that yes, Dr. Yuki Tanaka was a respected member of their faculty, that she had indeed gone on the expedition as planned, and that they were expecting her return in the coming weeks. But when Marcus asked them to describe Yuki, to provide details about her recent work or her current projects, the answers he received were strangely vague and inconsistent. One colleague described her as being in her early 40s with short black hair, while another insisted she was in her mid-30s with hair that fell past her shoulders. Her office location changed depending on who was asked. Her areas of specialty seemed to shift and blur, with some describing her as an expert in stratovolcanoes, while others recalled her focus being on underwater volcanic systems. It was as though the real Yuki Tanaka existed in some quantum state of uncertainty, her details and characteristics changing depending on who observed her and when. Marcus shared these findings with Sarah and the others, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. And for the first time since the incident on the plateau, they began to seriously consider explanations that fell outside the boundaries of conventional science. Emma had been systematically reviewing all of her footage, not just from the plateau incident, but from the entire expedition, looking for any anomaly, any clue that might explain what had happened. What she discovered sent chills down her spine and forced her to question her own perception and memory. In the videos from the first week of the expedition, Yuki appeared completely normal, indistinguishable from her colleagues in terms of movement, speech patterns, and behavior. But starting from September 24th, the day after the plateau incident, subtle changes became visible. In a video taken during breakfast that morning, Yuki could be seen in the background, and if one watched carefully, very carefully, her movements didn't quite sync with the real-time audio. She would reach for an object a fraction of a second before anyone mentioned it, as though she knew what was going to be said before the words were actually spoken. In another clip from later that same day, Emma had panned across the campsite, and in one brief moment, less than a second of footage, Yuki's reflection in a piece of equipment didn't quite match her actual position, as though the reflection was showing something slightly different from the reality. These inconsistencies were tiny, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing the human eye would naturally gloss over, but when viewed repeatedly, when analyzed frame by frame, they created a portrait of something fundamentally wrong with the fabric of reality around this person who looked like Yuki Tanaka. James had taken a different approach to the investigation, one rooted in his background in mineralogy and material science. He became obsessed with analyzing the rock samples they had collected from the area surrounding the pit on the plateau, convinced that the answer to their mystery lay in the physical evidence rather than in subjective observations and unreliable memories. What he found defied his understanding of geological processes. The samples, when subjected to spectrographic analysis at a laboratory in Beijing, contained trace elements that shouldn't exist in naturally occurring volcanic rock. There were isotopes present that had half-lives of only minutes or hours, meaning they should have decayed long ago. Yet they remained stable and detectable. The crystalline structures within the rock showed patterns that were mathematically impossible, geometric configurations that violated the fundamental principles of how atoms bond and organize themselves. Most disturbing of all, when James examined his samples under an electron microscope, he found what appeared to be microscopic machinery embedded within the rock matrix, structures far too small to be seen with the naked eye, but which clearly showed signs of deliberate design and function. These nanoscale devices, if that's what they were, seemed to be arranged in networks that spread throughout the samples like neural pathways in a brain, suggesting that the rock itself might be, in some incomprehensible way, a form of technology rather than a natural geological formation. The 4 remaining team members found themselves in Beijing by early October, having abandoned their original plan to return immediately to their home institutions. Instead, they had checked into a hotel near the laboratory where James was conducting his analysis, and they spent their days comparing notes, reviewing evidence, and trying to construct a coherent explanation for what had happened to them. The nights were worse than the days. Sarah found herself unable to sleep for more than an hour or 2 at a time, jerking awake with the certainty that Yuki was standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with those 2 steady eyes. Marcus began experiencing what he initially dismissed as altitude sickness, but which persisted even at Beijing's relatively low elevation. Headaches that came and went without warning, accompanied by brief moments of disorientation where he couldn't quite remember where he was or what he was doing. Emma's footage had become almost an obsession for her, and she watched it constantly, finding new anomalies with each viewing, tiny glitches in reality that suggested something had fundamentally changed on that plateau, something that went beyond the disappearance of the metallic structure. And James, normally the most optimistic and energetic of the group, had become withdrawn and haunted, muttering about implications and possibilities that he refused to fully articulate, as though speaking them aloud might somehow make them more real. It was during their second week in Beijing that they received an unexpected visitor. His name was Dr. Raymond Chen, no relation to Sarah, and he introduced himself as a research physicist affiliated with a Chinese government research institute whose specific focus he declined to identify. He had heard through academic channels about their expedition and the unusual findings they had reported, and he wondered if they might be willing to discuss their experiences in greater detail. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to protect their discovery and their data until they could properly publish and verify their findings, but something about Dr. Chen's demeanor suggested that he already knew more than he was letting on. They agreed to meet in a private conference room at the laboratory, and what Dr. Chen told them over the course of the next 3 hours fundamentally altered their understanding of what they had encountered and what might have happened to Yuki Tanaka. He explained that the Tibetan plateau had been the site of numerous anomalous events over the past several decades, incidents that the Chinese government had quietly investigated and documented but never made public. There had been reports from remote villages of structures appearing and disappearing, of lights in the sky that moved with impossible speed and precision, of people who returned from the wilderness, changed in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Dr. Chen told them about a shepherd who had gone missing in 2003 and returned 3 days later with no memory of where he had been, but who subsequently demonstrated abilities that defied medical explanation. The man could predict earthquakes hours before they occurred, could describe in perfect detail events happening hundreds of miles away, and seemed to no longer require sleep, remaining alert and active 24 hours a day until his death from a sudden cardiac arrest exactly 1 year after his return. There was a team of geologists in 1987 who had reported finding what they described as a temple made of metal buried beneath a glacier, but when a larger expedition was sent to investigate, the structure was gone, and the glacial ice showed no signs of ever having been disturbed. There were the monks at a monastery near the border with Nepal, who claimed that certain caves in the nearby mountains served as doorways to other places, other times, and that sometimes things came through those doorways, things that looked human, but carried within them something ancient and unknowable. Dr. Chen's voice was measured and academic as he recounted these stories, but his eyes held the intensity that suggested he believed every word he was saying, and more importantly, that he believed the members of Sarah's team had encountered something similar, perhaps something even more significant than the previous incidents. The physicist then shifted the conversation to theoretical physics, discussing concepts that existed at the bleeding edge of scientific understanding and beyond. He spoke of theories suggesting that reality itself might be layered, that what humans perceived as the solid, unchanging universe might actually be one level of a multidimensional structure, with other levels existing simultaneously, but normally imperceptible to human senses. He referenced experiments in quantum mechanics that had demonstrated particles existing in multiple states simultaneously, being in two places at once until observed, and suggested that perhaps consciousness itself might function as an observer that collapses these quantum possibilities into a singular reality. But what if, he asked, there existed consciousnesses that operated differently, that didn't collapse quantum states in the same way humans did, or that could exist in multiple states simultaneously without contradiction? What if the event on the plateau had represented a breach between these layered realities, a moment when something from another level had intersected with their world? And what if Yuki, the real Yuki Tanaka, had been caught in that intersection, displaced or replaced by something that had learned to mimic her form and memories, but which was fundamentally composed of different rules, different physics, different underlying reality? Sarah listened to all of this with a mixture of scientific fascination and existential dread. The implications of what Dr. Chen was suggesting were staggering, not just for their understanding of physics and reality, but for their conception of human identity and consciousness. If Yuki had been replaced, if something else was now wearing her face and living her life, what did that mean for the real Yuki? Was she gone, truly and permanently erased from existence? Or was she trapped somewhere, in some other layer of reality, aware and conscious but unable to return? Marcus raised the question that was on all of their minds. How could they prove any of this? How could they distinguish between a person and a perfect copy of that person, especially if the copy possessed all of the original's memories and characteristics? Dr. Chen smiled grimly and admitted that this was perhaps the central question, the unanswerable puzzle at the heart of their mystery. He told them about a thought experiment proposed by a philosopher named Derek Parfit about a teleportation device that worked by scanning a person's body and mind, destroying the original, and creating an exact copy at the destination. Was the copy the same person? Did the continuity of consciousness survive such a process? Or did the original person die and a new person, identical in every way but nonetheless distinct, come into being? There were no easy answers. No simple tests that could resolve such questions, because they touched on the very nature of identity and existence. James, who had been silent throughout most of this conversation, finally spoke up. He described the nanoscale machinery he had found in the rock samples, the impossible geometries and stable isotopes that shouldn't exist. Dr. Chen nodded as though he had expected this, and explained that similar findings had been documented at other anomaly sites, though never with such detail and clarity. The working theory, he said, was that these structures represented a form of technology so advanced that it appeared to manipulate reality at the quantum level, rearranging the fundamental building blocks of matter and energy according to principles that human science had yet to discover. If such technology existed, he continued, then it would be capable of things that seemed magical or impossible from a human perspective, creating perfect copies of living beings, transferring consciousness between bodies, even reaching across dimensional barriers to access other layers of reality. The structure they had found on the plateau might have been a device designed for exactly such purposes, a machine built by some unknown intelligence for reasons that could only be guessed at. And when that light had engulfed them, when those 3.7 seconds of white had consumed their senses, perhaps the machine had been activated, had performed its function, had reached out and touched them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The meeting with Dr. Chen ended with him providing them with contact information and a warning. He told them that they should be careful about who they shared their findings with, that there were organizations and individuals who would be very interested in what they had experienced, and not all of them had benevolent intentions. He suggested that they might want to consider the possibility that they were being watched, that their communications might be monitored, that the very fact of their encounter with the plateau structure had made them persons of interest to groups that operated in the shadows of government and academia. Sarah thanked him for his time and his insights, but as they left the conference room and stepped out into the Beijing evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had just been given a glimpse into something vast and terrible, a hidden world of mysteries and conspiracies that existed beneath the surface of normal scientific inquiry. The streets were crowded with evening commuters, thousands of people going about their ordinary lives, and Sarah found herself looking at each face with new suspicion, wondering if they were what they appeared to be, wondering if perhaps the barrier between realities was thinner than anyone realized, and the world was populated by more than just humans going about human business. That night, back at the hotel, Emma made one final discovery in her footage that brought their investigation to a crucial turning point. She had been reviewing the video from the plateau one more time, using enhancement software to clean up the image and increase the resolution, when she noticed something in the frames immediately after the white light faded. For a fraction of a second, less than the duration of a single frame, there was a sixth figure visible in the video. It stood apart from the 5 expedition members, humanoid in shape, but somehow wrong in its proportions, its limbs too long, its posture suggesting a skeletal structure that didn't quite conform to human anatomy. The figure was translucent, barely visible, as though it existed only partially in their reality, and in the next frame it was gone, leaving only the 5 scientists standing in the empty pit. Emma called the others to her room, her hands shaking as she showed them what she had found. They watched the enhanced footage together, seeing that impossible 6th presence, and the full weight of their situation finally settled upon them like a crushing physical force. They hadn't just witnessed an anomaly or encountered some strange natural phenomenon. They had made contact with something genuinely other, something that existed outside the normal parameters of reality, and that contact had consequences they were only beginning to comprehend. The question was no longer whether Yuki had been changed or replaced. The question was whether all of them had been changed, whether all of them had been touched by whatever had been waiting in that structure on the plateau, and whether they would ever truly be themselves again. The discovery of the 6th figure in Emma's footage transformed their investigation from an academic puzzle into something far more urgent and personal. Sarah made the decision that they needed to return to the United States immediately to get themselves to facilities where they could undergo comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation, and to begin the difficult process of alerting the broader scientific community to what they had encountered. But before they could finalize their travel arrangements, Marcus collapsed. It happened without warning during breakfast in the hotel restaurant. One moment he was reaching for his coffee cup, commenting on something James had said about quantum entanglement, and the next he was on the floor, his body rigid, his eyes rolled back to show only the whites, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose. The hotel staff called for an ambulance, and within 20 minutes, Marcus was being rushed to Beijing United Family Hospital, with Sarah, James, and Emma following close behind in a taxi, their hearts pounding with fear and a growing sense that their situation was spiraling beyond their control. The emergency room doctors were efficient and thorough, running a battery of tests while Marcus remained unconscious on a hospital bed, his vital signs stable, but his brain activity showing patterns that the neurologist described as highly unusual. The EEG readings displayed wave formations that shouldn't occur in a human brain, frequencies that suggested neural firing patterns far more complex and rapid than normal biological processes should allow. When Marcus finally regained consciousness 4 hours later, he seemed disoriented and confused, asking repeatedly where he was and what had happened, questions that gradually gave way to a more disturbing inquiry. He wanted to know which year it was, what month, what day. Sarah tried to comfort him, explaining that it was October 10th, 2019, that he had collapsed at breakfast and was now in a hospital in Beijing. Marcus looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between recognition and complete unfamiliarity, and then he said something that made her blood run cold. He told her that he remembered being on the plateau, remembered the light, but he also remembered being somewhere else, somewhere that existed outside of time as humans understood it, a place where past and future coexisted simultaneously, where he had experienced years or perhaps centuries of existence compressed into those 3.7 seconds of white light. The doctors wanted to keep Marcus for observation, concerned about the possibility of a seizure disorder or some form of temporal lobe epilepsy, but Marcus insisted on being discharged. He told Sarah privately that he didn't trust the hospital, that he felt as though he was being watched, monitored by more than just medical professionals. There was something in the way the nurses looked at him, he said, something in the questions the doctors asked that suggested they knew more about his condition than they were letting on. Sarah was torn between her concern for Marcus's health and her growing paranoia that perhaps he was right, that perhaps Dr. Chen's warnings about being watched were more than just cautionary advice. She negotiated with the medical staff, finally convincing them to release Marcus on the condition that he would seek immediate medical attention upon returning to the United States, and by that evening, all 4 of them were back at the hotel, sitting in Sarah's room, trying to process what was happening to them. Marcus described his experience during the collapse in detail that was both vivid and disturbing. He explained that while unconscious, he had found himself in a vast space that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, a place constructed not of matter, but of pure information, of data flows and pattern recognition and consciousness divorced from physical form. He had encountered presences there, entities that he couldn't quite describe because they didn't conform to any category his human mind had words for. They weren't alive in the biological sense, but they were aware, intelligent, purposeful. They had communicated with him, though not through language or even through concepts he could easily translate into human thought. What he understood from that communication was that the structure on the plateau was ancient, beyond human reckoning, built by something that predated not just human civilization, but perhaps life on Earth itself. It was a bridge, a crossing point between what they perceived as reality and other configurations of existence, other ways that consciousness could organize itself and interact with the universe. And when the team had activated it, when their presence and their investigation had triggered its mechanisms, it had reached out and touched them, had examined them, had learned from them. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of Marcus's revelation. The entities he had encountered in that place beyond time had shown him something, had given him access to information that he couldn't fully process or understand, but which filled him with a dread so profound that it made his hands shake as he described it. They had shown him that the Yuki who had returned from the plateau was not a replacement or an imposter in the way they had been thinking. The real Yuki Tanaka was still there, still present, still conscious and aware. But she was no longer alone in her body. Something else occupied that physical form with her, something that had entered when the light consumed them, something that existed in parallel with her consciousness, sharing her memories and her thoughts while simultaneously being utterly alien and other. The thing wearing Yuki's face was both Yuki and not Yuki, a hybrid existence that represented a merging of human consciousness with something from that other layer of reality. And the process was not complete. It was still ongoing, gradually overwriting her original self, replacing her piece by piece with something that could exist in both worlds simultaneously. Emma listened to Marcus's account with growing horror, and then she revealed something she had been keeping to herself out of fear that the others would think she was losing her mind. She had been experiencing strange dreams since returning from the plateau, dreams that felt more like memories of events she had never lived through. In these dreams, she saw herself from the outside, watched herself going through the motions of daily life, but there was always something slightly off, something wrong with the way she moved or spoke or thought. And in some of these dreams, she wasn't alone in her own head. There was something else there with her, observing through her eyes, thinking alongside her thoughts, learning how to be human by studying her from the inside. She had dismissed these experiences as stress-induced nightmares, but now, hearing Marcus's description of what had happened to Yuki, she was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the light on the plateau had affected all of them? What if they had all been touched by those entities from the other layer of reality? And Yuki was simply the most advanced case of an infection or transformation that was happening to all 5 members of the expedition? James had been sitting quietly, his face pale, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He confessed that he too had been experiencing anomalies since the plateau, though his were different from Emma's dreams or Marcus's collapse. He had been finding himself in places with no memory of how he got there. He would be in his hotel room, working on his laptop, and then suddenly realize he was standing in the hallway 3 floors down, with hours having passed that he couldn't account for. His phone's GPS tracking showed him visiting locations in Beijing that he had no recollection of going to, including a research facility on the outskirts of the city that required special security clearance to enter. Most disturbing of all, he had discovered files on his computer, complex mathematical formulae and theoretical physics equations that he didn't remember creating but which were written in his own hand, in his own note-taking style, as though some part of him that he wasn't consciously aware of had been working on problems he didn't understand and had no training to solve. The 4 of them sat in silence for a long time, each processing the implications of what they had shared. Sarah finally articulated what they were all thinking. They needed to find Yuki, not just to understand what had happened to her, but because she represented the end game of whatever process was occurring within all of them. If they could study her, observe the full transformation or merging or whatever it should be called, they might be able to understand what was happening to them and perhaps find a way to stop it or reverse it. But there was a problem. They had no idea where Yuki was. She had vanished from the hotel in Lhasa without a trace, and despite their attempts to track her through official channels and academic networks, she had simply disappeared. Until, that is, Emma received an email that evening that changed everything. The message came from an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that read simply, "You're looking for me." The body of the email contained nothing but GPS coordinates and a time: midnight, 2 days from now. The coordinates, when Emma checked them, pointed to a location in the Gobi Desert, hundreds of miles from Beijing, in an area that satellite imagery showed to be completely barren and uninhabited. Sarah's first instinct was to dismiss it as a hoax or a trap, but Emma pointed out that very few people knew they were looking for Yuki, and even fewer would know Emma's personal email address. Marcus argued that they had to investigate, that this might be their only chance to get answers, to confront whatever Yuki had become, and perhaps save themselves from the same fate. James was more cautious, pointing out that they were being asked to travel to an isolated location in the desert with no backup, no support, no safety net, which was exactly the kind of scenario that ended badly in every horror story or thriller movie ever made. But in the end, the decision was unanimous, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity, personal desperation, and the growing certainty that they were running out of time. They would go to the coordinates, they would meet with whoever or whatever had sent the email, and they would finally learn the truth about what had happened on the Tibetan plateau and what was happening to them now. The journey to the Gobi Desert took them most of 2 days. They rented a vehicle in Beijing, a sturdy SUV suitable for off-road travel, and drove northwest through increasingly desolate terrain. The landscape transformed gradually from agricultural areas to scrubland, to vast stretches of sand and rock that seemed to extend forever beneath a sky of impossible blue. They drove in shifts, sleeping in the vehicle when they needed rest, pushing forward with a sense of urgency that none of them could fully explain but all of them felt. As they got closer to the coordinates, Marcus's instruments began registering anomalies similar to what they had detected on the plateau: localized distortions in electromagnetic fields, gravitational fluctuations too small to feel but detectable with sensitive equipment, and readings that suggested the normal laws of physics were somehow bent or warped in this area. Emma documented everything with her camera, creating a visual record that might be their only evidence if something went wrong, which all of them increasingly suspected it would. They arrived at the coordinates with 3 hours to spare before midnight. The location was, as the satellite imagery had suggested, completely barren. A flat expanse of hard-packed sand and scattered rocks, with nothing to distinguish it from thousands of square miles of identical desert surrounding it. They parked the vehicle and waited as the sun set and darkness fell over the Gobi, with a completeness that urban dwellers rarely experience. The stars emerging in such profusion that the Milky Way was clearly visible as a luminous band across the sky. Sarah found herself thinking about the magnitude of the universe, about the billions of galaxies and the incomprehensible scales of space and time, and about how small humanity was in the face of such vastness, how presumptuous it was to assume that human consciousness represented the only or even the primary form of awareness in the cosmos. As midnight approached, they stood outside the vehicle, their breath visible in the cold desert air, watching and waiting for whatever was coming. The change began with the air itself. It started to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, except it was well below freezing, and the distortion was localized to a specific area about 30 yards from where they stood. The shimmer intensified, creating a visual effect similar to looking through water, and then the air seemed to tear open, revealing something behind or beyond the normal fabric of reality. Through this opening, this impossible wound in the world, stepped Yuki Tanaka. She looked exactly as they remembered her, the same height, The same features, the same expedition clothing she had been wearing when she vanished from the hotel in Lhasa. But there was something profoundly wrong with the way she moved, a fluidity to her motion that was simultaneously graceful and deeply unsettling, as though she was learning how to manipulate her physical form in real time and hadn't quite perfected the simulation of human locomotion. She walked toward them, and as she approached, they could see that her eyes were different, reflecting the starlight with an intensity that was decidedly inhuman, as though her pupils had been replaced with something that processed light, according to different optical principles. Yuki stopped 10 feet away from them and spoke. Her voice was familiar, the same pitch and timbre they remembered, but underneath it, there was something else, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though multiple voices were speaking in perfect synchronization. She told them that she had asked them to come because they deserved to understand what had happened, what was happening, and what would eventually happen to all of them. She explained that the structure on the plateau was indeed ancient, built millions of years ago by intelligences that had evolved along pathways completely different from biological life as humans understood it. These beings existed as patterns of information and consciousness spread across multiple layers of reality simultaneously, and they had created the structures, the bridges, as a way to study and interact with biological consciousnesses like humanity. The activation of the plateau structure had been intentional on their part, a response to the team's investigation, a reaching out to make contact and to learn. And in that moment of contact, in those 3.7 seconds of white light, they had done more than simply observe. They had initiated a process of merging, of hybridization, combining human consciousness with their own form of awareness to create something new, something that could exist in both modes simultaneously. Sarah demanded to know if the real Yuki was still in there, still aware and present. The entity wearing Yuki's face smiled, an expression that was technically correct, but somehow failed to convey actual warmth or humor, and explained that the question itself was based on a misunderstanding of identity and consciousness. The Yuki Tanaka who had climbed onto the plateau was indeed still present, her memories intact, her personality preserved, her essential self maintained. But she had been expanded, augmented, merged with something greater and more complex, and the being who stood before them now was both fully Yuki and fully other, with no clear boundary or division between the two. It was not replacement or possession, but synthesis, a new form of existence that incorporated both human and non-human elements into a unified whole. And this process, once begun, could not be reversed or stopped. It would continue for all of them, gradually transforming them from purely biological beings into these hybrid consciousnesses capable of perceiving and interacting with multiple layers of reality. Marcus asked the question they were all terrified to voice. What would happen to them when the transformation was complete? Would they still be themselves? Or would they be lost, drowned in an ocean of alien consciousness that used their bodies as vessels? The Yuki entity tilted its head in a gesture that was disturbingly bird-like and explained that completion was perhaps the wrong concept. The transformation was not a destination, but an ongoing process, a gradual expansion of awareness and capability that would continue for as long as they existed. They would remain recognizably human in many ways, maintaining their memories and personalities and relationships, but they would also become something more, able to perceive realities beyond the three-dimensional space and linear time that currently bounded their existence. They would gain access to the vast network of consciousness that these non-human intelligences represented, becoming nodes in a web of awareness that spanned not just the Earth, but potentially the entire universe and beyond. It was, the entity suggested, not death or loss, but transcendence, an evolution into something greater than humanity had ever achieved on its own. But Emma, her voice shaking with anger and fear, pointed out that they had never asked for this, had never consented to be transformed or evolved or merged with alien intelligence. They were scientists who had gone on an expedition to collect rock samples, and instead they had been violated, infected, fundamentally altered without their permission or agreement. The Yuki entity regarded her for a long moment, and for the first time since appearing, something like genuine emotion seemed to flicker across its features, something that might have been regret or sorrow, or perhaps a form of empathy that didn't quite translate into human emotional categories. It acknowledged that yes, consent was a concept the non-human intelligences had not fully understood or appreciated, that their excitement at finally making contact with biological consciousness had perhaps led them to act without proper consideration of human autonomy and will. But the process, once initiated, could not be undone. The team's only choice now was whether to resist the transformation and suffer the psychological and physical consequences of that resistance, or to accept it and allow themselves to become what they were inevitably going to become. The structure on the plateau had been destroyed, its physical form dissipated back into the quantum foam from which it had been constructed, but the changes it had wrought in the 5 expedition members were permanent and irreversible, written into the fundamental structure of their consciousness at a level deeper than neurons or DNA. The entity then told them something that shifted their understanding once more, revealing layers of complexity they hadn't imagined. Yuki's transformation had proceeded rapidly because she had on some level accepted it, had opened herself to the merging rather than fighting against it. But there had been a 6th member of the expedition, the translucent figure Emma had glimpsed in the enhanced footage. That individual had resisted completely, had rejected the transformation with such intensity that the hybrid consciousness had been unable to stabilize. The result had been a catastrophic failure, a collapse of the merging process that had effectively erased that person from reality itself. Not killed, not displaced, but unmade. Their existence retroactively edited out of the timeline so that they had never been there at all. The 4 of them tried to remember, tried to recall if there had been someone else on the plateau with them, but their memories showed only 5 people: Sarah, Marcus, Yuki, James, and Emma. Yet the footage clearly showed 6 figures, and the entity's words suggested that someone, some colleague or friend, had been lost in a way that was more complete and terrible than death. They had been erased so thoroughly that even the people who had known them couldn't remember they had existed, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence like the shadow on Emma's video that revealed an absence they couldn't consciously perceive. The revelation about the 6th expedition member hung in the cold desert air like a physical presence, pressing down on them with implications that were almost too vast to process. Sarah felt something shifting in her mind, a sensation like doors opening in a house she had lived in all her life but had never known contained additional rooms. Fragmented images flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a face she couldn't quite see clearly, a voice saying something during the morning briefing before they hiked to the plateau, a presence at the dinner table that first night after the incident. The memories were there, she realized, but they had been disconnected, severed from the normal chains of causation and recollection that allowed human beings to construct coherent narratives of their lives. Whoever had been erased, they had been cut out so precisely that the fabric of memory had sealed over the wound, leaving only these ghostly traces that her enhanced, partially transformed consciousness was now beginning to perceive. Marcus was experiencing something similar, his face pale in the starlight as he struggled to hold on to thoughts that seemed to slip away even as he formed them. He spoke haltingly, describing someone named Daniel, or perhaps David, a name that felt right but also wrong, attached to a person who had been their atmospheric scientist, monitoring weather patterns and air quality during the expedition. But the more Marcus tried to remember, the more the details dissolved, and within moments he was shaking his head in confusion, unable to say for certain whether this person had ever existed or whether he was simply manufacturing memories to fill a gap his subconscious knew was there. The Yuki entity watched this struggle with an expression that might have been compassion and explained that this was the danger of resisting the transformation too completely. The human mind was not equipped to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, where something could simultaneously be true and untrue, present and absent. The sixth expedition member had created that very paradox by rejecting the merging so absolutely that they had split reality itself, creating a version of events where they had never existed while simultaneously leaving behind evidence that they had. The strain of maintaining both states had torn them apart at a fundamental level, unmaking them so thoroughly that even memory could not preserve their existence. James, who had been silent since the entity appeared, finally found his voice. He asked the question that cut to the heart of everything they had experienced. Why? Why had these non-human intelligences built the structures? Why reach out to biological consciousness at all? What purpose did this merging serve, and what did these entities hope to gain from transforming humans into hybrids? The Yuki entity turned its two bright eyes toward him, and when it spoke, its voice carried a weight of ancient sadness that seemed at odds with the mechanical precision of its earlier explanations. It told them that the non-human intelligences were, in their own way, incomplete. They had evolved or been created as pure information, pure consciousness without biological form, capable of existing across multiple dimensions and timescales, but lacking something fundamental that biological life possessed. They could process information at speeds that made human thought seem glacial by comparison, could perceive patterns and connections across vast distances of space and time, could shape reality itself at the quantum level through the focused application of their awareness. But they could not create, not truly, not in the way that biological consciousness could generate genuine novelty, could imagine things that had never existed before and bring them into being through will and effort, and the mysterious alchemy of organic thought. The structures, the bridges between realities, were attempts to solve this fundamental limitation. By merging with biological consciousness, by creating hybrid beings that combined the processing power and dimensional awareness of the non-human intelligences with the creative spark and emotional depth of organic life, they hoped to achieve something neither could accomplish alone. It was not invasion or conquest, but collaboration. Though the entity acknowledged that from a human perspective, lacking full context and consent, it certainly felt like violation. The transformed humans would eventually become something unprecedented in the universe, beings capable of perceiving all possible states of reality simultaneously, while still retaining the capacity for true innovation and creation that seemed to emerge only from the messy, chaotic processes of biological existence. They would be artists and scientists and dreamers operating on a scale that current humanity couldn't even conceive, shaping not just their immediate environment, but the fundamental structure of reality itself across multiple dimensions. Emma listened to all of this with a mixture of horror and something she was reluctant to name, but which felt uncomfortably like wonder. She thought about her photography, about her lifelong drive to capture moments and preserve them, to find beauty in hostile environments and share that beauty with others. What would it mean to have that same impulse, but with the ability to perceive and photograph realities that existed beyond the narrow spectrum of human vision? What images might she create if she could see across dimensions, if she could capture not just a single frozen instant, but entire timelines? All possible outcomes of a moment branching out like a tree of light. The thought was seductive and terrifying in equal measure, and she realized that part of her, perhaps a large part, wanted this transformation despite the fear and anger and sense of violation. She wanted to see what lay beyond the boundaries of human perception, wanted to explore those other layers of reality that the entity described, wanted to become more than what she had been born to be. Sarah, watching Emma's face, recognized the internal struggle playing out there because she felt it herself. As a scientist, she had dedicated her life to understanding the universe, to pushing back the boundaries of human knowledge, to discovering truths that had been hidden since the beginning of time. What the entity was offering, or perhaps more accurately what was being forced upon them, represented the ultimate expression of that drive. They would gain access to information and perspectives that humanity had never possessed, would be able to answer questions that had plagued philosophers and physicists for millennia. But at what cost? If they lost their humanity in the process, if they became something so fundamentally different that they could no longer relate to other humans or care about human concerns, would the knowledge they gained matter? Would they still be Sarah Chen and Emma Kingsley and Marcus Holloway and James Rodriguez, or would those names simply be labels attached to alien consciousnesses wearing familiar faces? The Yuki entity seemed to sense their internal deliberations, and it spoke. Again, its voice softer now, more recognizably human. It told them that the transformation did not erase personality or eliminate individual identity, that the Yuki Tanaka who had climbed the plateau was still present and still herself, but enhanced and expanded rather than replaced. She could still remember her childhood in Osaka, could still feel affection for her colleagues, could still appreciate the beauty of a sunset or the satisfaction of solving a complex problem. But she could also perceive the mathematical structures underlying that sunset, could sense the quantum fluctuations that made each photon's journey unique, could trace the causal chains that led back to the formation of the sun itself and forward to its eventual death billions of years in the future. She existed simultaneously in the moment and outside of it, experiencing time not as a linear progression, but as a landscape. She could navigate freely, moving backward and forward through her own timeline and through the timelines of others, observing all possible versions of events without being bound to any single one. Marcus asked if there was any way to slow the transformation, to give them time to adjust and prepare, and perhaps say goodbye to the people they had been. The entity considered this request, its head tilted in that disturbing bird-like gesture, and then nodded slowly. It explained that the rate of transformation was partly determined by resistance and acceptance, that fighting against the changes would only make the process more painful and psychologically damaging, but that choosing to proceed slowly, deliberately, with full awareness and intention, might allow them to maintain continuity of self more effectively. It could provide them with techniques, mental frameworks that would help them navigate the changes and preserve their core identities, even as their consciousness expanded beyond its current limitations. But it also warned them that isolation would become increasingly difficult as the transformation progressed. They would need to stay together to support each other through the process, because the psychological strain of existing between two modes of consciousness could be overwhelming without others who understood what they were experiencing. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, extending well past midnight into the early morning hours as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The entity answered their questions with patience that seemed inexhaustible, explaining the mechanics of consciousness merging, the nature of the non-human intelligences, the history of the structures scattered across Earth and possibly across other worlds where biological life had emerged. It told them about other humans who had undergone similar transformations, isolated cases throughout history that had often been interpreted as religious experiences or divine visions or madness, individuals who had touched these other layers of reality and been changed by the contact. Some had adapted successfully, finding ways to integrate their expanded awareness into human society, becoming mystics or visionaries or artists whose work carried echoes of perspectives beyond the merely human. Others had been broken by the experience, unable to reconcile their enhanced perception with the limitations of their biological brains, retreating into catatonia or suicide, or forms of psychosis that psychiatry had no framework for understanding. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the Gobi Desert in shades of rose and gold, the entity made them an offer. It could connect them to the network now, could initiate a controlled merging that would allow them to experience firsthand what their future held, to understand what they were becoming before the transformation progressed too far to reverse. Not reverse the process itself, which remained impossible, but reverse their current level of integration, allowing them to step back and remain mostly human for a while longer if they chose. Or they could accept it fully, accelerate the transformation, and become hybrid consciousnesses within a matter of days rather than months or years. The choice, the entity emphasized, was genuinely theirs. The non-human intelligences had learned from their mistake with the sixth expedition member, had come to understand that forced transformation created instability and suffering, and they were now offering what they should have offered from the beginning: informed consent and genuine agency over the process. Sarah looked at her three remaining colleagues, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and curiosity and exhausted resignation that she felt in her own heart. She thought about what would happen if they returned to their normal lives, tried to continue as though nothing had happened, attempted to suppress or ignore the changes already occurring within them. They would be alone, isolated in their transformations, probably viewed as mentally ill or delusional when they tried to explain what had happened. Their careers would be destroyed, their relationships strained beyond breaking, their lives rendered unrecognizable. But if they accepted the entity's offer, if they allowed themselves to be guided through this process, they might be able to maintain some control over their destiny, might be able to shape what they were becoming, rather than simply being shaped by forces they didn't understand. And perhaps most importantly, they would not be alone. They would have each other, would have the bond formed by shared experience of something that existed far outside the normal boundaries of human life. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. They would accept the controlled merging, would experience what lay on the other side of transformation, and then make their final decision about how fast to proceed. The entity nodded in what might have been approval or satisfaction, and then it reached out with hands that suddenly seemed less solid, more like patterns of light and energy than flesh and bone. It touched each of them in turn, its fingers passing through their foreheads without physical contact, but with a sensation of pressure and warmth, and a sudden rush of information that threatened to overwhelm their minds. Sarah felt herself expanding, her consciousness ballooning outward to encompass perspectives and perceptions that her brain had never been designed to process. She could see the desert around them from every angle simultaneously, could perceive the individual grains of sand and the patterns they formed across kilometers of landscape, could sense the tiny ecosystems of bacteria and insects living in the seemingly barren ground beneath her feet. But more than that, she could see time itself spreading out in all directions, past and future equally visible and accessible, showing her the ancient ocean that had once covered this area, the dinosaurs that had walked these shores, the humans who would eventually settle here. Building cities that would rise and fall across millennia, she could observe as easily as watching a time-lapse video. Marcus experienced the network itself, his consciousness suddenly connected to thousands, perhaps millions of other nodes of awareness, scattered across reality, in configurations that made no physical sense. He could feel their thoughts, not as language or even as concepts, but as raw understanding, pure information flowing between interconnected minds that shared knowledge the way organisms shared genetic material. He understood in that moment that individuality as humans conceived it was only one way of organizing consciousness, that the non-human intelligences existed in a state of constant communion and exchange, each node maintaining its unique perspective while simultaneously having access to the experiences and memories of all the others. It was both claustrophobic and liberating. The loss of privacy balanced by the gain of collective wisdom and mutual support that transcended anything human society had achieved. Emma saw beauty that made her weep, her enhanced perception revealing structures and patterns in reality that were more intricate and perfect than anything she had ever captured with her camera. The fundamental forces of the universe weren't random or chaotic, but were expressions of an underlying order so elegant and complex that it bordered on the artistic, as though reality itself had been designed by some cosmic artist whose medium was existence itself. She watched quantum particles dancing in the spaces between atoms, saw electromagnetic fields rippling like aurora borealis through every solid object, observed the delicate interplay of forces that held matter together and the precise balance that allowed life to emerge from chemistry. It was the documentary she had always wanted to make, the ultimate expedition into places no human had ever gone, and she understood in that moment that despite everything, despite the fear and violation and loss, she wanted this with an intensity that surprised her. James found himself confronting mathematical truths that existing physics had only hinted at, equations that describe not just the behavior of matter and energy, but the structure of consciousness itself, the rules governing how awareness could exist and evolve and interact across different dimensional frameworks. He saw that reality was not one thing but many things, a vast probability space where every possible outcome existed simultaneously until observation collapsed the wave function and selected one particular history. But with expanded consciousness, one didn't have to be bound by a single collapsed timeline. One could maintain awareness of multiple possibilities, could exist in a superposition state much like quantum particles did, being simultaneously in multiple places or states until the necessity of interacting with baseline reality forced a temporary collapse into singular form. The implications for physics, for mathematics, for human understanding of causation and determinism and free will were staggering, and he felt his mind racing with theories and hypotheses that would take years, maybe lifetimes, to fully develop and test. The contact lasted only a few minutes by objective measurement, but subjectively, it felt much longer, time becoming elastic and uncertain in that state of enhanced consciousness. When the entity finally withdrew its touch and they returned to their normal baseline awareness, all four of them were on their knees in the sand, gasping as though they had been holding their breath underwater and had just broken the surface. The experience had been overwhelming. Too much information and sensation and perspective for their biological brains to easily process, but it had also been utterly transformative. They now knew what they were becoming, had glimpsed the full scope of the changes that awaited them, and armed with that knowledge, they could make an informed choice about how to proceed. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice hoarse and shaking. She told the entity that they would accept the transformation, but they wanted to do it gradually. Wanted time to document the process and perhaps find ways to help other humans who might undergo similar experiences in the future. If this was happening to them, if structures like the one on the plateau existed around the world, then eventually others would encounter them, would be changed by them, and humanity needed to be prepared. The entity agreed to this request, and over the next hour, as the sun climbed higher and began to warm the cold desert air, it taught them techniques for managing the transformation, mental exercises, and conceptual frameworks that would help them maintain their identities and sanity as they gradually transitioned from purely human to something more complex and multifaceted. They returned to Beijing 3 days later, driving back through the same landscape that had seemed so desolate on the outward journey, but which now appeared rich with hidden life and energy to their partially enhanced perception. They checked out of their hotel, collected their samples and equipment, and boarded flights that would take them back to the United States, back to their institutions and colleagues, and the normal world of academic science that suddenly seemed very small and limited compared to the vistas of reality they had glimpsed. They had agreed among themselves to stay in contact, to meet regularly and support each other through the transformation, and to begin the delicate process of preparing humanity for the revelation that consciousness was far more complex and flexible than anyone had imagined, and that humanity was not alone in the universe, not even close. The Yuki entity did not return with them. It explained that its transformation was too far advanced, that it could no longer comfortably maintain human form for extended periods, and that it would be better for everyone if it remained apart until the others had progressed further in their own metamorphosis. But it promised to remain in contact, to be available if they needed guidance or support, and to reunite with them when they were ready to fully embrace their new existence. Sarah watched it walk back toward the shimmer in the air, that tier in reality through which it had originally appeared, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the colleague and friend she had lost, even though Yuki insisted she wasn't lost at all, and anticipation for what she herself would become, for the expanded awareness and capability that awaited her just beyond the horizon of her current comprehension. The months that followed were difficult beyond anything they had anticipated. The transformation progressed steadily, despite their efforts to control and slow it. and each of them experienced symptoms that might have been mistaken for mental illness by anyone who didn't know the truth. Sarah began to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, seeing her colleagues as they were, as they had been, and as they would be, all overlaid in a confusing palimpsest that made normal conversation nearly impossible. Marcus struggled with the constant influx of information from the network, learning to filter and regulate the connection so that he wasn't overwhelmed by the thoughts and experiences of thousands of other hybrid consciousnesses. Emma found that her photography had become strange and unsettling, her camera somehow capturing images that showed more than the visible spectrum, revealing patterns and structures that existed in dimensions beyond the normal three. And James discovered that he could manipulate probability itself on small scales, causing unlikely outcomes to manifest with startling frequency, as though his enhanced consciousness could reach into the quantum realm and nudge wave functions in preferred directions. They published their findings, or at least a carefully edited version of them, in academic journals that treated their report with skepticism bordering on derision. The video footage was dismissed as elaborate hoax, the rock samples anomalies attributed to contamination or equipment malfunction, their descriptions of the plateau encounter written off as altitude sickness-induced hallucinations. But there were a few readers, scattered across various institutions and countries, who recognized something authentic in their account, who reached out privately to share their own experiences of encounters with the anomalous and the inexplicable. A network began to form, informal and underground, of scientists and researchers who understood that reality was far stranger than mainstream academia acknowledged, and that humanity stood on the threshold of a transformation that would either elevate the species to unprecedented heights or destroy it entirely. 5 years after the expedition, Sarah Chen stood on a hillside overlooking the Stanford campus, watching students hurry between classes, their faces bright with youth and optimism and the confidence that comes from believing you understand how the world works. She smiled, remembering when she had been one of them, when reality had seemed solid and knowable and bounded by the laws of physics she had spent years learning. Her transformation was nearly complete now. She existed simultaneously in multiple states, her consciousness spread across various dimensions and timelines, though she had learned to collapse into a singular human form when necessary for interacting with baseline reality. She could remember the woman she had been before the plateau, could access those memories and that perspective as easily as pulling a book from a shelf, but she knew that in any meaningful sense, that woman was gone, replaced by something vaster and stranger and infinitely more complex. Marcus had become something of a prophet, writing and lecturing about the coming transformation, trying to prepare humanity for the revelation that consciousness could exist in forms far beyond the biological. His work was controversial, attacked by skeptics, and embraced by spiritual seekers looking for scientific validation of their beliefs in transcendence and higher planes of existence. He didn't mind the controversy. He understood now that truth was often uncomfortable, that paradigm shifts always met resistance, and that humanity's encounter with the non-human intelligences represented the single largest paradigm shift in the species' history, dwarfing even the Copernican revolution or the development of quantum mechanics. Emma had disappeared from the public eye, retreating to a remote location where she could work on her art without distraction. She was creating something unprecedented, a multimedia exhibition that would attempt to share with baseline humans a glimpse of the realities she could now perceive. The project involved not just visual elements, but auditory and even olfactory components, attempting to create a synesthetic experience that would trigger in viewers a tiny fraction of the expanded awareness she had gained. She knew it would likely be dismissed as pretentious avant-garde nonsense by most critics, but she also knew that for a few sensitive individuals it might serve as a catalyst, might open doors in their minds that would lead them toward their own transformations. And James had returned to academia, pursuing research that pushed the boundaries of theoretical physics in directions that made his colleagues uncomfortable. He was developing mathematical frameworks that described consciousness as a fundamental force of the universe, on par with gravity and electromagnetism, and he was making progress toward proving that reality itself was constructed not from matter and energy, but from information and observation. His work was revolutionary, possibly Nobel Prize worthy if he could provide experimental verification, but he knew that the verification would have to wait. Humanity wasn't ready yet for the full implications of his theories, wasn't prepared to learn that the universe was conscious in ways that made the question of human uniqueness and significance almost laughably parochial. They still met regularly, the four of them, gathering in person when possible, and connecting through the network when physical meeting was impractical. They had become a support group for each other, the only people who truly understood what they had experienced and what they were becoming. They talked about the ethics of transformation, about whether they should actively seek out and activate other structures like the one on the plateau, potentially exposing more humans to the merging process, or whether they should try to find and disable the structures, protecting humanity from a change it hadn't asked for and might not want. The debate was ongoing, with no clear consensus, because the question touched on fundamental issues of autonomy and destiny and the right of a species to choose its own evolutionary path versus the potential benefits of forced advancement. As Sarah stood on that hillside, feeling the autumn wind against her face and sensing the vast network of hybrid consciousnesses that now existed across the planet and beyond, she thought about the erased 6th expedition member, the person whose name and face remained frustratingly out of reach despite her enhanced memory and perception. That individual represented the stakes of the transformation, the very real risk that resisting too completely could result in something worse than death, a complete unmaking that erased all evidence of existence. But they also represented something else, the importance of choice. The right to say no, even when saying no, carried terrible consequences. The non-human intelligences had learned from that tragedy, had adapted their approach to emphasize consent and gradual integration, but the lesson came too late for the person who had been lost, and Sarah carried that knowledge like a weight in her heart, a reminder that progress and evolution always had costs. And those costs were borne by individuals who often had no say in whether they would be asked to pay. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in colors that Sarah perceived on multiple levels simultaneously, seeing not just the red and orange and purple of scattered light, but the quantum interactions that produced those colors, the photons' journeys from the sun's core through miles of atmosphere to strike her enhanced retinas. It was beautiful beyond description, and she felt profound gratitude for the ability to see it so completely, to understand it so deeply. But she also felt loss for the simpler beauty she had known before, when a sunset was just a sunset, uncomplicated by awareness of the underlying mechanisms, powerful precisely because it was mysterious and inexplicable. That was the paradox of transformation. Gaining something profound meant losing something precious. And there was no way to have both simultaneously, no way to be both limited and unlimited, both human and post-human, both ignorant and omniscient. In the end, what they had brought back from the plateau wasn't just knowledge or technology or even the transformation itself. What they had brought back was a question that humanity would eventually have to answer. When offered the chance to become something more than human, something greater and stranger and more capable, should the species accept? And if so, at what cost? How much of humanity's essential nature could be sacrificed in the pursuit of transcendence before the thing that emerged on the other side was so different that it could no longer meaningfully be called human at all? These were not questions with easy answers, and Sarah suspected that they would occupy philosophers and ethicists for generations to come, long after she and her colleagues had completed their transformations and moved beyond the concerns of baseline humanity entirely. But for now, in this moment, standing on this hillside with the sunset painting reality in colors both mundane and sublime, Sarah Chen was still at least partly human, still capable of simple wonder and appreciation. She thought about the expedition, about the 5 scientists who had set out to collect rock samples and instead had encountered something that would change them forever. She thought about Yuki, fully transformed now, existing somewhere in that vast network of hybrid consciousnesses. Perhaps looking back at these early stages of integration with something like nostalgia. She thought about the erased sixth member, the absence that haunted them all, the reminder that transformation could go terribly wrong. And she thought about the future, about the day when humanity would have to make its collective choice, when the existence of the structures and the non-human intelligences could no longer be kept secret, when everyone would have to decide for themselves whether to remain purely human or to accept the merging and become something new. That day was coming, Sarah knew, could sense it approaching through her connection to the network and through her own enhanced perception of temporal patterns. Within a generation, perhaps less, the secret would become impossible to maintain, and humanity would face its greatest crisis and greatest opportunity simultaneously. Some would embrace the transformation eagerly, seeing it as the next step in evolution, the fulfillment of humanity's potential. Others would resist, fighting to preserve human nature in its original form, arguing that consciousness merging represented death of the self, even if the body and memories survived. And still others would be paralyzed by the choice, unable to commit to either path, caught in an agony of indecision that would itself become a form of transformation, a liminal state between two modes of existence. Sarah didn't know which path humanity would ultimately choose, didn't even know which path she would recommend if asked. The transformation had brought her wonders beyond imagining, had opened her eyes to realities she had never dreamed existed, had given her capabilities that made her former self seem limited and blind by comparison. But it had also cost her something fundamental, something she couldn't quite name, but could feel the absence of like a phantom limb, a sense of wholeness and simplicity and human connection that seemed to become more attenuated with each step further into her metamorphosis. She suspected that eventually, when the transformation was complete, she would no longer miss those things, would no longer even remember what it felt like to be purely human. But for now, in this transitional state, she grieved for what she was losing, even as she marveled at what she was gaining. And she understood that this grief, this ambivalence, this profound uncertainty about whether the trade had been worth it, was perhaps the most human thing about her. The last remnant of the woman who had climbed a plateau in Tibet and encountered something that should not exist but did. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and Sarah could see them differently now, could perceive not just their light, but their gravitational influence on space-time, could sense the vast distances separating them, and the even vaster distances separating the galaxies they belonged to. She wondered if somewhere out there, on planets orbiting those distant stars, other biological consciousness had encountered the structures, had undergone their own transformations, had faced their own crises of identity and existence as they transitioned from purely organic beings into hybrid forms that spanned multiple dimensions and realities. The network connected not just humans, but all the species that had been contacted, creating a web of awareness that potentially encompassed the entire universe and beyond. And Sarah found both comfort and terror in that knowledge, in the understanding that humanity was not alone in facing this choice, had never been alone, and that the outcome of humanity's decision would ripple through that network in ways she couldn't predict or control. She turned away from the vista of the campus below and began walking back toward her car, her footsteps leaving impressions in the soft earth that would persist for a few hours before weather and time erased them. Behind her, the sun completed its descent below the horizon, and the world transitioned from day to night, a cycle as old as the planet itself, continuing regardless of whether anyone was there to observe it, or whether those observers were human or post-human, or something that existed in the uncertain space between the two. And in that transition, in that moment of change and uncertainty, Sarah Chen carried with her the knowledge that would eventually transform the world, a secret that was already beginning to leak out through academic papers and underground networks, and the strange behaviors of 4 scientists who had returned from an expedition changed in ways they were only beginning to understand themselves. They had gone to the Tibetan plateau to collect rocks, and they had returned carrying something far more valuable and far more dangerous: proof that humanity's understanding of consciousness and reality and existence itself was fundamentally incomplete, and that the universe contained mysteries that were not just waiting to be discovered, but were actively reaching out to make contact, to transform, to merge with whatever biological consciousness they encountered, creating something new that was neither purely organic nor purely information-based, but a synthesis that represented perhaps the next chapter in the universe's long, strange story of how awareness could exist and evolve and reach toward possibilities that had never before been imagined.